we're going to start with tech services work orders that really work. Our presenters are Aaron Grant and Sean Romaine. Aaron is the Director of Cataloging and Metadata Services at the University of Washington. In 2015, as the Cataloging Unit Head at Georgia Tech, she began participating in a migration from Voyager to Alma. And fall of the same year, she became the Head of Metadata Services at Emory and began participating in a concurrent migration from Aleph to Alma. Despite experiencing the beginning to middle of one migration at Georgia Tech and the middle to the end at Emory, she managed to stay relatively sane during this 2-for-1 migration special. Sean Romaine is the Director of Acquisitions and Rapid Cataloging Services at the University of Washington. From 2013 to 16, he served as the library's ILS coordinator, and from 16 to 17 served as the chair of the Orbis Cascade Alliance's Technical Services Working Group. Sean occasionally dreams of a universe where no library ever has to go through a system migration again. So, okay, you guys can share. All right. I can see your screen.
Okay, great.
So can everyone hear me and see our screen okay?
Yes.
Great. So thank you for the introduction. So today we're going to talk a little bit about technical services work orders that really work, or hopefully will work. So a more detailed outline. So we'll talk about what work orders are, how they are configured. And then Aaron's going to talk a little bit deciding how to or how not to configure your work orders. A little bit about the lessons that we learned, both what Aaron learned at Emory and Georgia Tech and what we learned at UW, and we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. As we go through the presentation, we wanted to point out that UW is a fairly large and unwieldy organization, so some of the problem points that we hit upon may not be as relevant for you because you might have a much simpler workflow to deal with. So what are work orders? So work orders are a type of request, so they function like patron holds or resource requests. They're a way to track a physical inventory process. So work orders are not used on electronic or digital inventory. They're only used on physical inventory. So for example, you might use a work order to track a physical item as it moves from acquisitions through to cataloging, through to your marking room or your book prep area. They are a way to indicate a series of steps in a workflow. So if you want to indicate to someone else in your organization where your book is, for example, in technical services, if it starts in acquisitions but then goes to cataloging and then maybe goes to a special type of cataloging after that, it allows people to see at all times where the item is in your workflow. They're also easily customizable. So here's a sort of a graphic representation of the basic order workflow. An item may be paged or requested. At that point, the item may be scanned into the work order department and a status set. The item may be placed into a work order as part of a request process or as part of the keep in department option in the Alma receiving workbench. Optionally, an operation is performed in the item, such as cataloging or repair or marking. And at that point, when the operation is completed, the work order is done, which sets the status to in transit, indicating the item should be returned to its home location. The home location, which is usually a circulation desk, then returns the item to change the status from in transit to item in place. And then quickly, where do you configure work orders? So if you go to the configuration gear setting in Alma and go to general and then go to work order and departments, you can set it up there. It requires a general system administrator role. Once you're in there, there are 2 steps to setting up your work orders. So the first step is to create a work order type. Think of the work order type as the overall name of the workflow you wish to manage or control. A default work order type, which sets the keep in department options in the Alma receiving workbench, is generally set up during migration. However, you may decide to set up additional work order types for workflows that are not connected to the Alma receiving workbench. For example, you might set up a work order type for reserves to manage reserve workflows, or work order type for preservation to manage preservation activities. The second step is to create the work order department. So as you set this up, think about what departments will use the work order. The work order department is the unit that manages and is served by the work order type. who's going to manage the work order queue, and then note that the work order department may represent a library unit, a technical services unit, or a library desk. And then again, as I think I mentioned a few minutes ago, the keep in department work order for tech services is usually set up during migration. So that's the one default work order that is usually set up for you when you work with migration, Ex Libris migration staff. Work order types may serve one or many departments or desks. For example, at the University of Washington, our keep in department or technical services work order type is used by East Asia Technical Services, Law Library Technical Services, as well as the Central Technical Services units. A work order department can only manage one work order type. So Law Library Technical Services, for example, could not be linked to both the keep in department and the reserve work orders types. You must set up two separate departments to manage different work order types, even if in reality you only have one physical department that handles both work order types. And then again, just to go over the keep in department work order that I talked about, this is integrated into the ALMA receiving workbench. It allows physical inventory to be placed in a work order process as part of the receiving workflow. So for example, an item received in acquisitions may then move to cataloging. The operator can receive the item, set the status to cataloging to indicate where the item is in technical services. The cataloger could then catalog the item and set the status to marking to indicate the item had been moved to marking. If your institution has multiple acquisition units, they will share the acquisitions technical services or keep in department work order type, although the queues will be separate. So some things to consider as you set up your work order. Does the process need to serve multiple technical services units? If so, what are the common steps, since the technical services units will all share the same statuses? Will the item be processed by more than one person? Are there several places to which an item could be sent after being received, or just one? If there's only going to be one status that you need to set up, it'll probably be fairly easy to set up your work order department. Then consider what staff members will be doing the work and will know the workflow best. And then finally, consider that there are some places in ALMA where Ex Libris gives you just enough rope that you can hang yourself. So think about when you're building something, have I just built a gallows from which I will devolve myself into terrible workflows, which will be awful to get out of. And here to talk about that experience is Erin.
Okay, so yeah, based on experience of previous institutions where we set up our work orders differently than UW, I'd like to share two main factors to consider when setting these up and give some kind of practical examples of what we could have done better and suggestions for taken from my experience here about how we did set them up to work better with our existing workflows. For each factor, I'll share what didn't work, why not, and then suggest improvements. So the first problem that we had at my previous institution is out of the box, we set up multiple tech services departments, each with their own separate work orders and statuses. So like Sean talked about during migration, we set up the keep in department work order to really represent the work of the acquisitions and cataloging units. But we also at the same time set up a bindery and preservation work order department, each with their own work order statuses. And this, in hindsight, turned out to be a poor approach. So this is kind of a graphic representation of how it worked. And there's a lot of lines you'll notice going to a lot of different places. And this really is what ended up hampering us in the long run, because each of these lines represents a point where we had to scan out of the original work order department. Then the item would be in transit, and then we had to scan into the next department to receive it and continue working on it. So this was not ideal. Some of the pain points we experienced, again, too much scanning into and out of departments of items. It really ended up not scaling up well, particularly if it's one thing when you have a single item to do this, but if you've got a truckload of things, it quickly becomes a real burden to do this at scale. We also, there was a lot of switching of staff between multiple locations or these work order departments in order to scan out of and into departments. So that took a lot of time, a lot of clicks. It was Nobody enjoyed that. This next one, the heartache of items constantly in transit, this was definitely more about us setting up workflows that really did not work for circulation. It drove them nuts, and we love our friends in circulation and we want to keep them happy. So if they constantly have to respond to things that are in transit and look for them and make sure they're not missing, it just gums up their workflows. We also ended up with a lot of situations where, because we had multiple departments with multiple work orders, where we would have what I call the inception of work orders, where we would have work orders with another work orders with another work order on top. And this led to these tangled situations where you really didn't know where to receive it to get rid of the work order and in which order you had to do what. And sometimes we just had to delete items and recreate them. So really, what we had done was design something that was just overkill for what we were actually doing, and it ended up being a real hindrance to our work. So I'm here to try and prevent you from doing that. So what I found with University of Washington, what we've done is really set up one mainstream keep-in department tech services work order department that serves multiple tech service departments, so acquisitions, cataloging, and preservation. And this corresponds to our mainstream workflow for incoming materials. So anything that's that comes in from acquisitions or gifts, anything that needs to go through the whole usual process is really represented in this workflow. And then we ended up creating more kind of outlier work order departments for kind of more boutique or less frequent workflows or situations as we needed them. But most of the number of items flows through this mainstream work order department and statuses. So to kind of give you an example of how this looks in practice, so I've got the mainstream workflow on the left in this keep-in department work order department for acquisitions, cataloging, and preservations, or our ARCs, CAMs, and preservation are the names of our departments. So, and I've just kind of given some examples of some of the statuses that we use in this work order, and they're sequential but modular. So an item doesn't have to flow through every single status. You can kind of pick and choose where it goes to depending on what level of treatment and what type of treatment is needed. But the ending step is almost always preservation marking, which is when the item gets physically processed and then flows on to CERC, where they handle the material. And on the right is kind of representative of these outlier work order departments that we created for cataloging and for preservation, for really more recataloging or again, boutique kind of work, recon projects, mistakes, things we need to correct, that kind of thing. And this was also helpful in our general paging system for materials coming to these, because the CAMs and preservation are both physically separate departments on different floors in very different areas. So we couldn't use the existing keep-in department workflow for routing items. It just wasn't physically expedient to do it that way. And we didn't want one department to have to parcel these things out. So that was part of the thought behind this too, is making these both workflow and location specific, the CAMs and preservation departments. But I would caution, just don't overdo it in this situation. If your cataloging department is the person at the desk, next to you, you probably don't need to go as far as creating a whole different work order department. Okay, so the second problem we encountered was really us creating too many statuses during migration. And this was a result of a lot of issues, which hopefully I will steer you away from recreating during your migration experience. So we had created 12 statuses just in the cataloging work order department, acquisitions cataloging work order department, which turned out to be way, way too much. Some of them you can see here, awaiting cataloging, in cataloging. So we'd created 12 statuses, and then there's also a kind of default technical services, default auto-assigned status, which I call the one to rule them all, because this one you can actually use to take off any of the other statuses, which is helpful. It's kind of like a wild card for removing statuses when you don't know what status was originally assigned. And then there was also an additional technical migration status that was assigned to things that were currently in process when we migrated. So some of the pain points we encountered from creating too many statuses was just an overall clutter and confusion in display for tech services staff. I mean, it's a usability issue. You want to really reduce the number of things available if you can. We also had a lot of vague and poorly defined statuses, so nobody really knew what in process meant, or in repair parentheses technology. We had no idea. I don't know where this came from. We also had some overlapping or ambiguous statuses that really resulted from trying to create this workflow to be able to apply to multiple departments, but not being thoughtful about awaiting cataloging and in cataloging, basically pretty much meaning the same thing. So that confused folks about which one to use. We also threw some statuses in there that anticipated needs that we were going to start doing but had not yet begun, like digitization prep, which was not a thing that we were doing. So this is like buying clothes for when you anticipate losing weight. Just don't do it. It may happen, and then you can create that status, but you don't need to, be predictive about what you're going to create out of the box. And we also ended up creating some statuses that represented non-technical services work, which we kind of talk about later as far as collaborating with other departments and kind of consulting widely, which is a great idea. So this, I think, was an ideal perhaps, but it didn't work. It didn't work in our implementation of it because the functions the work statuses that we added represented work being done by circulation and stacks, which were we didn't work regularly with them day to day. So it was just too weird of a mixture of things that didn't work for practical purposes. So again, more of the things that ended up not working for us. So this slide is a little deceptive. It looks like we just deleted these statuses, but in reality, this was a huge amount of work to reduce these numbers. Because when you set them up, then you have a lot of items with these particular statuses, and you can't just delete them until you change the statuses to something else. So, and unless things have changed in ALMA, there was not a job to kind of do this in a batch. You really had to do a lot of workarounds that required a lot of work. And one other thing we ended up doing that I would not do again is so when you set up these statuses, you can give a code in the back end for what, kind of a clue as to what the work order status is. So at Emory, we assigned numbers for these. I'm not sure why, but it led to a really confusing display in the item display where, we had a technical services code of 12. What does a 12 mean? Nobody knows. You had to remember something or consult a list. So I really like what we've done at University of Washington, where we've come up with some kind of a clue, an alpha clue to give some indication of what the work order is, even if the entire label isn't displayed in a certain part of ALMA. So yeah, I really suggest kind of what I'm calling curated statuses for your work order departments. And this is really, being thoughtful about how you're going to set them up. Really thinking about and mapping your workflows before you start this process. It doesn't have to be a big thing. It doesn't have to be a institution-wide endeavor. You can really be quick and dirty about it. Just be thoughtful about how you're going to structure things, how your work actually works, not necessarily how it worked in your previous system, but how it really flows from person to person and kind of type of work to type of work. Again, start with just a few statuses and keep them simple. Try to to go for a high level of explanation and things. Create statuses only for what you need now, not for something you think you might need in the future. Again, it's easy to add stuff going forward. Think about, make sure you have clear definitions for all the statuses that you're going to use. Exercise caution when you're adding statuses representing work of departments outside of tech services. And yeah, again, you can add statuses later on, much easier than removing one. So some of the final lessons learned just from the difference of institutions where I've been through migration is really kind of disentangling the work order department from the actual library department. We were really stuck in this mentality at Emory where, the preservation department had to have its own work order department, and you really don't need that. Maybe work order department is perhaps not the best name, but it's what we have. But really think about combining all of those into one workflow. That really represents the mainstream of where the majority of your items flow. Again, collaborate and consult widely. I think if we had consulted with circulation more at Emory in setting these up, we might have avoided some of the problems that we ended up having post-migration. Think about ways to keep your statuses and your work order departments in general very simple and high level. Start small and view all your results in all the modules in Alma. Again, that's how we could have possibly avoided having weird numbers show up in the item display. Write down what you did and why you did it, just so you have a record for posterity. And then something that I'll just mention at the end is that sometimes we still have workarounds that are necessary sometimes for some cases of bound with items or bound together items. We end up, it's just easier and faster for us to delete the item and then recreate the item rather than taking off the work order. So this was something I never even thought about. I didn't even know you could do this. So that is an option. Sometimes there are tips and tricks that you can do. So that is it for us. Thank you, and we can take questions.
Sure. So there's one question so far, and if anyone else has any questions, please put them in the Q&A. Carol wanted to know, just as a point of clarification, is marking your equivalent of saying physical processing?
Yes.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, I know every library kind of has their own nomenclature for that. So it's like, yeah, I don't know what that, yeah. So does anybody else have other questions? I know at least in SUNY, when we had our big 4-day sit down with the Ex Libris people, camp a couple of weeks ago, they kind of stressed this idea of work order departments don't have to equal physical departments, probably because they've seen these other migrations where it's like that. And meanwhile, I'm in a really, really tiny library and I'm only going to a slightly larger library. So this whole thing, I'm like, wow, you guys are like your own consortia just in your own library.
Oh, good. I'm glad they're doing that. We hadn't really heard that when we were migrating it at Emory. So I'm glad to know that they're giving more guidance, because this is, again, in hindsight, this is something that I would have loved for somebody to tell me at the time, because I really didn't have a clear picture of what the work orders could do, what they could be used for, and how you could use them. So I just felt a lot of floundering.
Stephen, I guess this is more of a comment than a question, said we manage statuses in the item record by changing the process type field. We found that prevents them from having things go into transit, which they don't want because they're a small shop. I guess that was more of a comment than a question, but sort of pointing out an alternate way for a smaller institution. I know there's some, I feel like there are some ways to bypass or reassign things, but I could be wrong on that. Work orders are not my specialty. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, right. No, I was just going to say that I think we explored processes for some other things, particularly lost and missing, but if I remember correctly, you're kind of stuck with the processes as they are. You can't really you can't call them other things.
Okay.
Yeah.
Carol wanted to know, I guess this is the amusing question. How many people do you suppose would have retired earlier than they would have without Alma? I guess that's assuming there may have been retirements.
Probably, I would say probably we had at least 5 to 10 people that may have stayed longer.
If they hadn't had to like redo everything, relearn everything.
I don't think it traumatized anyone at Emory so much that they left. But we're catalogers. We have other things that traumatize us, RDA and LRM.
I do remember when RDA came out that was a lot of people retired because of that. Anna wanted to know, if you delete and put another record in, does that mess up any PO attached to the record?
Correct. So you would have to, if it's a monographic item, you would have to link it back up to the PO. Where we tend to delete item records that have a work order on them is if it's, so when we receive unbound periodicals, we don't barcode them. So in order to send them upstairs to cataloging, to have cataloging work done, we need to give them a barcode. So we put in a piggyback dummy barcode, send them upstairs to cataloging. They do the work, it comes back down. If we then want to done the work order, that sets the item record to in transit, which we don't want to have happen because we don't barcode these anyway. So normally what we do is we just delete the dummy barcode in the item record and then create a new one for the unbound issue. Because normally we don't barcode our unbound issues at all. We only barcode them with a dummy barcode if we're going to send them upstairs to cataloging.
Interesting. Zimmer wanted to just know, I guess from Anna, do they mean at the item level or at the holdings level? Well, I guess that's a question for them. So.
Oh, for the PO?
Yes, if you delete an item record and it's linked to a PO line, I'm assuming that's what, yes.
Yeah.
If you delete an item record that's not linked to a PO line, it's a holding records that's linked to the PO line. You don't have to worry about updating it. I don't know if I'm making sense.
Anna chimed in. I'm wondering what level, like the whole record, or I guess again, item level, holdings level, like what level?
Oh, sorry, just the item record.
Okay. Does anybody else have any other questions? We have a couple minutes before our last presentation of the day. I give people a couple minutes to type.
We have really liked work orders in our previous ILS. Once something came into acquisitions, it just got a status of in process, and then as it moved through technical services to cataloging or preservation, nobody had any idea where it was. So if someone placed a hold on it, we had people that would go searching on 3 different floors trying to find out where this book is. So now that we have this keep in department work order, we can actually track much more closely where an item is as it moves through tech services. So as cumbersome as the work orders sometimes are, they really actually are a help for customer service.
Okay, great. Any other? Edward wanted to know, did you start with documenting your workflows or in an Alma template workflow and adjust to local practices?
So what do you mean by an Alma template workflow?
I guess the default workflows or the ones that are recommended in the documentation?
Oh, well,
Edward can clarify if I'm not getting it right. Oh, yeah, yes, exactly.
So we documented our workflows to start.
Yeah, at Emory, actually, Sean and I had been talking about this yesterday a bit in preparation for this. But at Emory, we had a really long pre-migration process. There was about 2 years where we started preparing, and that ended up being kind of a hindrance because we went through this whole, well, actually, I wasn't there yet, but they had gone through this whole documentation of all the workflows and all of the libraries, and it was a big, huge process. And then people. It was in so much advance notice of the actual migration that people kind of had forgotten all that work by the time that it actually got to migration and really didn't benefit from how that work had been done. It was also a kind of a much granular level that ended up not being so helpful for how to set up work orders.
Yeah. Edward just had a follow-up. So when people say do things the Alma way, how do you know what that way is?
Well, usually it means follow what the implementation team tells you or what you learn in training and what's in the manual. I mean, you'll quickly find out what's not the Alma way because something will break and be stuck somewhere and you can't figure out how to fix it.